right, maybe we can have everyone take seats. We get started. We have a pretty packed agenda today. So, all right. Okay. Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Boston, to the Boston Fed. My name is Egon Zakrajsek. I'm the Director of Research here at the Boston Fed, and it's very pleased to welcome you today on the 69th Annual Economic Conference and open our program. I just have a few housekeeping details to start us off. The first note, the first point is that we have a number of media members joining the conference. So as a reminder, all sessions, that includes all speakers' remarks, Q&A, and any comments recognized by the moderator are going to be on the record. So keep that in mind. Any informal conversations, such as those during breaks, meals, or receptions, are off the record. So that's just something for everyone to keep in mind. And then now it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Collins, the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, who will provide conference welcoming remarks. As President and CEO, Susan oversees all the bank activities, including economic research, analysis, banking supervisions, financial stability efforts, community economic development activities, and then a wide range of payments, technology, and finance initiatives. Susan is a widely published international macroeconomist with a lifelong interest in policy and its impact on living standards. She has served as provost, dean, professor, research scholar, and a board member in a variety of universities and organizations, including University of Michigan, the Brookings Institutions, Georgetown, and Harvard universities. You know, as an economist, for us, it's great to work for economists. So she has a PhD from MIT, and she did her undergraduate degree at Harvard. So please join me in welcoming Susan Collins to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks, Egon, and just really a pleasure to welcome all of you to our 69th Economic Conference. It's great to see some good friends and to reconnect, and also I look forward to talking with some new people. So delighted to have you all here, and also wanted to offer just a warm welcome to everyone who is watching on the live stream. Delighted that you're here with us as well. So as I said, this is the Boston Fed's 69th Economic Conference, and following our tradition, we feature expert analyses and engaged discussion, and I look forward to all of your contributions towards that, about an important topic that has a variety of implications, some near term and some medium to longer term as well, and it has implications economically for households, for businesses, for communities, and of course for policymakers. And so there are a number of dimensions to talk about. I do want to thank Egon Zakrajsek, our research director, and the entire research team here who have put together what I think promises to be a really informative and vibrant conference. And I also want to thank everyone who will be presenting research, panel remarks, who will be moderating the discussants, and all of their contributions to the Q&A sessions as well. Before I continue, of course, I do have to give my standard disclaimer. So the views that I'll express are, of course, my own. I don't speak for any of my colleagues at other reserve banks or at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. So the goals for this conference are really to examine some of the key factors that are shaping and reshaping the global economic landscape, and to consider how the U.S. economy may adapt to these changes, and to assess some of the implications for economic policy. And in that spirit, and as something of a preview, I just want to briefly highlight two important but intertwined factors, and those are themes that you'll hear about, I think, throughout our time together. One is heightened global risks, and that's a term that I'm going to use interchangeably with higher volatility, risks, and uncertainty to reference just a greater dispersion of possible future outcomes. And then the other theme, which is interrelated, is global economic fragmentation. And since this is a Federal Reserve conference, I want to briefly outline some of the implications of these issues for the conduct of monetary policy, but primarily over the medium term. So first, recent experience shows that the global economy faces increasing risks and uncertainties. And that means, I'm thinking such as risks from the pandemic, from global geopolitical flare-ups, extreme weather events, cybersecurity threats, a range of different types of uncertainties and risks. And at the same time, these risks are also inducing significant reconfiguration in trade, capital, labor, and technology flows, possibly leading to a more fragmented global economy. And when such risks materialize, they can disrupt global supply chains and in the process induce complex dynamics for domestic supply and demand. For example, that's demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and recent trade tensions. Furthermore, we should recognize that just the presence, the perception of heightened risk or uncertainty can affect economic behavior. And a large body of research shows that a more uncertain economic environment can weigh on aggregate demand by deterring investment and reducing spending. And in this way, the impact of these risks can extend beyond their actual occurrence. Elevated uncertainty can also lead to increased volatility in financial markets, potentially affecting firms' access to capital and their investment strategies, which could have important implications for economic activity and for financial stability. Periods of heightened uncertainty can also influence firms' pricing strategies, employment decisions, as business may hesitate to adjust prices to commit to hiring. And prolonged uncertainty may also discourage innovation and, as a result, hamper longer-term productivity growth. So there's a range of both near-term potential implications as well as medium to longer-term. Turning to the second of these intertwined topics, the world economy may also become more fragmented, partly in response to heightened global risks. For example, elevated risks are prompting U.S. firms, especially multinational corporations, to explore reshoring or nearshoring strategies, reducing dependence on distant and potentially unstable supply chains. Such strategies may also be reinforced by trade policies aimed at reducing dependence on foreign suppliers. And although designed to enhance domestic economic resilience, those types of insulation strategies could come at the cost of less efficient supply chains. And while greater fragmentation can insulate firms from some global risks, it can end up amplifying economic volatility by reducing the diversification both of firms' suppliers and of their customer markets. And this in turn can make economies less resilient both to external and to internal shocks. A fragmented global economy can also impede long-term productivity growth by hindering the diffusion of new technologies and ideas across borders. Overall, these two intertwined factors, increasing global risks and fragmentation, tend to depress short-term economic activity while reducing longer-term growth. But it's also important to note that these challenging conditions may catalyze some beneficial outcomes. Difficult environments can prompt firms to reassess their business models and their production processes, triggering a widespread implementation of cost-cutting and efficiency-boosting strategies. And in addition to investments in new and more efficient technologies and equipment, these challenges can foster a search for efficiency gains. And that's actually a mindset that I find to be ubiquitous when I am out and about in the First District, which is most of New England, the Boston Fed's region, and in conversations with business leaders, again, across the region. This dynamic, in my view, seems to align quite well with the post-pandemic U.S. experience, where labor productivity has surged notably. And it's also interesting to note that the recent period of prolonged heightened uncertainty coincides with increased investment in automation and in AI technologies. New risks can also drive innovation in risk management, potentially generating fresh business opportunities. For example, domestic firms may begin to leverage new technologies, such as advanced capabilities in AI, blockchain, cloud computing, and quantum computing to weather certain types of global risks. And these factors may yield favorable effects on economic growth, which could offset some of the potential negative costs that I mentioned previously, at least to some extent. Of course, the benefits and costs of these changes won't be evenly distributed. And while it's beyond the scope of the Fed's dual mandate, understanding which industries and regions potentially would gain from this evolving global economic environment does remain crucial. In any event, the increase in global risks and the movement towards greater economic fragmentation will likely be major and could be transformative, and the intertwined forces shaping our economic landscape are likely to unfold over the coming years. These are complex issues, and so it's really wonderful to be with all of you for the next day and a half and have the opportunity to delve into them a bit more deeply. And so I want to close with just a few brief thoughts about how this landscape of increased global risks and fragmentation could affect monetary policy making. But I do want to emphasize that the considerations that I'm going to raise are not affecting my near-term policy outlook, which I am not commenting on in these remarks. First of all, a more volatile and fragmented global environment could result in more volatile business cycles and inflation. And this could complicate the Fed's efforts to maintain price stability and maximum employment, especially if economic shocks in this new environment have a more substantial supply-side component. At the same time, greater fragmentation could insulate the U.S. economy from certain global shocks, potentially enhancing monetary policy effectiveness at stabilizing domestic economic conditions. Second, research has shown that the integration of economies through international trade was one contributing factor to the low inflation environment that prevailed for the 3 decades or so before the pandemic. The shift towards economic fragmentation could do the opposite and usher in a transitional period of inflationary pressures. However, these pressures could be mitigated by continued robust productivity gains, which I discussed earlier. Third, and finally, a more fragmented global environment could lead to less financial integration, and this in turn could raise domestic borrowing costs as well as affect financial conditions more broadly. So in all, the topics that I've outlined are complex and they're evolving pretty rapidly. There's a lot to learn from the emerging research and a lot to discuss. So I'm excited that we've brought together so many experts across various disciplines to share insights and perspectives, and look forward to a really healthy debate and continued collaboration. And so I am really looking forward to what I think is going to be an informative and lively day and a half, and I hope you are as well. Thanks again for your contributions and for your engagement. And so with that, it's now my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague, Jenny Tang, from the Boston Fed's Research Department, who will moderate the conference first session and really get us started. So thank you again very much.
Thank you, Susan. At this point, I'd like to invite the speakers up to the stage to join me. Both our speakers, Shabnam Kalamli-Özkan and Aaron Flay. So welcome to the first paper session of this conference. We're delighted to have Shabnam Kalamli-Özkan with us to present the first paper on global networks, risks, and the U.S. economy.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and talking to you today on global networks, risks, and the U.S. economy, joint work with Mohammed Yildirim. Yes. These are not my slides. These are mine. Great. All right. Let's get going. Global Networks, Risks, and the U.S. Economy. So the motivation for this work, actually goes to a very standard conventional macro open economy view, but the work itself is combination of several papers we have been doing with different co-authors since 2020, since the pandemic era. And paper after paper, we realize the issue with the conventional macro open economy view. What is this view? This view takes U.S. as a relatively closed economy because of the low trade shares, exports 10% of GDP, imports 14% of GDP. And that, of course, combines with the fact that U.S. is governing the world in terms of dollar dominance and deep financial markets. And on top of that, U.S. has an amazing central bank. As we are all here right now, we know that Federal Reserve acts as a global lender of last resort when things go south. The benchmark implication of this view is that U.S. has limited exposure to global risks. Now, and there is a perception that reinforces this. Shock after shock, the empirical perception actually reinforced by the fact that U.S. does fare better. Take two examples, 2008-2009, global financial crisis. It ended up being global, but it started in the U.S., homegrown. 2019-2020 pandemic, a truly global shock. Again, U.S. ended up faring better relative to what? Relative to other countries. We would like to revisit the issue in terms of asking directly how sensitive the U.S. economy to global risks once we account for full global trade, production, and finance networks, and really think about trades-off and counterfactuals, and basically revisit this issue that the fact that maybe your trade shares are low not necessarily imply you are not going to be affected from global risks, as Susan just defined them. So here's a picture of our framework. So this is a new global network framework. Why we say new? Because we are going to have layers of our network. So the trade is going to be there, but not just trade. Production is going to be there, not just that. Capital flows is going to be there. So financial linkage is also there too. And here I'm going to show you a version of this network where the countries are shown as big and the network itself shown with these thin gray lines. Later I'm going to show you a different version, but the point I'm trying to make here, even you take the key countries that you would expect US to be affected from, say Mexico, Canada, European Union in purple, China in red, and put all the rest of the world in this gray box, and those little boxes inside the bubbles are the sectors, and the arrows is like all the trade between the sectors. So even you just think the world composed of these 6 bubbles here. You can think about domestic shocks like natural disasters, sector-specific shocks, technology, policy shocks happening in the US. We know how to analyze them in a closed economic framework. But you can also realize that these shocks happening in China, the same thing, which will then become a foreign shock for US. And there are truly global events with the arrow on the top, like geopolitical risks, trade tensions, and financial risks. So how do we bring all this together and understand the US sensitivity to it? So that's the question we ask, and then we are going to develop a multi-layer global network that is going to have all these linkages across country sectors. A novelty of our work is going to employ a rich set of cross-sector and cross-country elasticities, not a single Armington one. And also we are going to have a rich set of global risk shocks, as in the opening remarks, Susan said, you can think them, all these things that create volatility, and I'm going to be specific about them. And then again, we are also going to be very flexible that these things can be external or homegrown. Then quantify the impact of these risks on US output, inflation, employment, and also financial conditions, both the things we care about on the real side and also what we care on the financial side. And why does this matter? Of course, the question is an important one, right? We want to understand US sensitivity and exposure to global risks. That's important in itself, but let me just put it also a bigger historical, a bigger context, a historical debate goes back to Kindleberger, 1941 address and work, and also Hirschman, 1945. And the idea here is that global stability is a public good, and if you're a hegemon, you're a leading economy like the US, you can never fully insulate yourself from global turbulence, right? And if you are that country, you have to supply open markets in terms of trade and finance to the world. You have to supply stable monetary arrangements to the world, and you have to act as a lender of last resort capacity, which basically what, of course, Britain did until the First World War, and after the Second World War, US took that job. Hirschman says, well, this world is going to have asymmetric trade dependencies, and we all understand that, and countries are going to use this as a geopolitical leverage. That's also well understood. But here, the key issue is instability is going to be created through that geopolitical leverage and through that dependencies, and it's going to feed back to the hegemon, right? So the hegemon is not, US is not free. Even US uses this geopolitical leverage, and our framework is here, gives you a quantitative setup in the world of complex supply chain to this logic. All right. Okay, so, this is a very short presentation, so I'm going to show you a bare-bone version of the framework, and then I'm going to show you 3 empirical applications for the pandemic, 2021 inflation, and geopolitical fragmentation, and then the recent 2025 trade war. So the framework is going to be a full-fledged global general equilibrium open economy framework, multiple countries, multiple sectors. There's going to be several layers of nested CS structure, both on the production side and the consumption side. And very important to our work is full input-output linkages are going to be there, domestic and international, not just one sector where you are importing intermediate inputs. In the baseline, we are not going to have any nominal rigidities, no financial frictions, just a flex price environment. No full dynamics, just the 2 periods, just to understand the intuition before and after the shock, before after the global risk hits your country. And then we then extend, adding wage rigidity, price rigidity, because we also would like to understand the role of monetary policy in this environment. The key novelty, again, rich matrix of granular elasticities, connecting everything from, rare earth steel to labor and capital and varieties. And we are going to also have a financial elasticity. And then the key here is the nonlinear amplification. For small shocks, you may not need all these details, but for large shocks in such a nonlinear setting, then results are going to be quite different based on what we know from the standard models. Okay, let me show you a picture. So here's the global trade and production network, and finance is, of course, hidden behind in all those gray arrows. But I want to make the point that generally, trade economists think a lot in terms of the blue, right? That's the trade network. So you can see that, larger countries are, larger nodes. The US, the light blue means you are less open. Dark blue is more open. Ireland is a more open country than the US. And, here we are showing the most intense trade relationship. Of course, you will see immediately Europe being popping out there because, of course, Europe is very central to global supply chains. Now, our point is there's also this figure red on the right. That's the domestic input-output network. Every economy has it. In general, when we incorporate that red inside the blue figure, we kind of tend to think in the tradable sector sense, right? That color coding tells you tradable sectors like electronics will be red, non-tradable sectors like construction is going to be pink, and we kind of not tend to think so much about them. Our point is no, that's not the correct way of doing it. Let's think the entire input-output domestic one inside the international one. So it's not about final goods trade. It's not about intermediate goods trade. It is also about the domestic trade and how those domestic links, domestic supply chains, link to the international supply chains. Now, this is globalization 1.0, the system we are living in. The data we are going to use here is going to be the 2020 input-output matrices from OECD. This is, of course, changing. We can talk more about that, but this change is going to take many, many years, if not decades. We are doing a lot of field work right now, talking to leading supply chain managers, CEOs, and CFOs. And the overarching conclusion is this is not going to happen tomorrow, not even before 5 to 10 years, and it's extremely difficult to beat China cost competitiveness. So in that sense, it's completely, what we learned from those, completely okay to use this as the existing network. All right. Now, production structure is going to be, again, 3 layers. So the bottom box is going to be sector I, say, the auto industry in United States using labor works in that sector, combines with an intermediate bundle. Can I do this? Yes, okay, here. And then that is, this intermediate bundle is going to be using many different varieties. So, so labor combines with steel, glass, oil and all that, and those are going to be coming from many countries. In fact, U.S. is going to be importing these things, but sometimes, it's still imported from China, might go to auto, still imported from Turkey, might go to construction. So this structure is going to capture all of that. Consumption, we are going to have a similar structure. So if this is the U.S. consumption bundle of, the houses, cars, groceries, and everything, they are going to be, of course, coming from different countries here. We are going to be very careful with this granular elasticity use, not only to differentiate between German cars and Japan cars, but also respecting the expenditure shares, but also we are going to be respectful of course, trade deficit and trade surpluses. We will not work with balanced trade. Now, the network propagation and the Domer weights is a very well-known result in the literature. I'm not going to go into details, but basically you have intermediate input share, final consumption share, input-output structure. Here helps you to have the Leontief inverse object that is going to map all this sector-level shock, labor supply shock, rare earth shock, you name it, oil shock, into the output effects in your country, but also globally. The point we want to make is with nonlinear propagation, you are going to move away from this conclusion that if you're a country with small trade shares, if you are basically a closed economy, this is going to mean you have small macro effects. So this is not the case in our network, especially when you have large shocks, especially when shocks are concentrated and asymmetric. Okay. So the key innovation here is to model these broad range of global risk. As Susan mentioning, think on labor side, you can think pandemic and immigration. On the energy side, it can be oil or electricity constraint because of the AI investment. It can be critical minerals, rare earth, or it can be finance. It can be dollar shortages. The point is, our modeling to these things is as a factor supply shock, a sectoral shock to a non-abundant factor. So you can put all these global risks to that level, right? So all of them is a sector, and then you are shocking the quantity of that sector. So think like, for example, labor supply. That's the sector-specific effective factor supply. Let's say labor or steel or rare earths is going to be shocked. This is the supply shock component, and the demand shock component is going to be done with these consumption weight, like your preferences changing, things like the pandemic, everybody moved from services consumption to manufacturing consumption. But the idea is to create this multi-layer network of trade, production, and finance where the shocks are sectoral and shocks are simultaneous to the supply and to the demand in that sector. Okay, that's the goal here. And then we are going to solve it using the techniques in trade and also the generalized version through the work of Bakai Fahri. All right. Now, we are going to apply this to 3 recent global risk episodes. One is the pandemic. Pandemic is a real risk. It's a health shock. The other one is the geopolitical fragmentation and inflation. You can see this as a real financial risk. And the third one is the recent trade war. And here, of course, it is both geopolitical and policy, because trade war is not just I'm putting this much tariff, I'm also doing it in a very volatile and uncertain way. Tariff can change from today to tomorrow. Tariff can be put and taken back and all that. So we are trying to capture both the uncertainty side of that and also the fact that there are tariffs that are taxed. All these 3 exercises, and again, you can definitely do other ones, but these 3 that we have done is going to show you strong transmission of these global risks, as we define, as also Susan mentioned in her speech, to the U.S. Transmission of these to the U.S., and this depends on the importance of all those indirect linkages, second-round spillovers, and nonlinearity. All right. So let me start with the pandemic. So how do we do the pandemic? Literally, all we need is a labor supply shock, right? Because it's a health shock, first and foremost, before the monetary policy, before the fiscal policy, before all that, it was you are sick, okay? How do we do that? We are going to have these sectoral labor supply shocks for 35 sectors, 65 countries using infections. So it's basically a shock to the effective labor input to the production. Then we are going to also have a sectoral demand shock to pick up these reallocation, where we are going to do non-parametric regressions of using data of US sectoral consumption from BEA on infections, and then we cross-check with the sector-level credit card data from the countries we have this data available. And we fit these shocks to the model, and remember, we are disciplining the model with that whole global network I showed you, which is going to help us not to deviate from the existing trade deficits and surpluses. All right. Let me show you one stark example out of that, how U.S. is actually really sensitive to these type of global risks. So this is something that close to what happened. U.S. is vaccinating fast in this scenario. Rest of the world is vaccinating slow. You can see where the U.S. is, and the lighter color is you have a small loss in terms of your real income. We can also convert this to welfare relative to 2019, relative to before pandemic. And the lighter the color is, it is a smaller loss. Here it is like a 0.15 to 0.3 loss for U.S. from left to right. We are changing the trade elasticity, right? If you make what you buy from the rest of the world fully substitutable or less than fully substitutable, you kind of move between a loss to your real income in the country, 0.1 to 0.3, okay? Now look at this scenario. This didn't happen, but could have happened. Only U.S. is vaccinated. This is a counterfactual scenario, but only U.S. is vaccinated. This could have happened, right? I mean, we accumulated vaccines 3 times the population of the country. And this could have been easily a scenario. Now, of course, the rest of the world is very dark red, but look at the U.S. Now, the U.S. loss is up to 1%. Up to 1% real income loss in the country. The country is entirely vaccinated here, right? It's just the rest of the world is going down the drain. Worse outcome for the U.S. And now, actually, the trade elasticity doesn't make that much difference, right? I mean, it's around 1% real income loss in both scenarios. All right. Let me now go to the second empirical exercise, the global fragmentation and inflation. This goes back to the work I did jointly with Alvaro Silva here. So how we are going to think the fragmentation is higher trade costs, barriers along the geopolitical lines, right? So we are completely exogenously assume this. I'm going to show you a picture on that, but it's just like, you are going to trade with your friends, Europe and Canada and Mexico, and not with others type of fragmentation. You can write down a first-order approximation to CPI inflation. I'm not going to go through the notation, but basically, change in the U.S. inflation is going to go through the usual things, right? The expenditures, exchange rate, productivity with a negative sign. There is this factor supply bit, right? If the factor supply goes, down, that's going to be inflationary. And there's this new term from our work, which kind of gets this local global demand-supply imbalance. Now, this is not the standard channel in the trade literature where there is a globally supplied input, say chips and semiconductors, and countries' demand for that input is high, and that creates inflation. This is different than that. This is about relative demand and relative prices, matched to relative demand and supply. So, yes, chips and semiconductors are globally demand. It is supplied by small countries, say Taiwan. But if U.S. demands them more than Brazil, because U.S. is doing a lot of investment into AI-related sectors, then U.S. inflation is going to be higher than Brazil. That's what this term captures. And this is just under any sectoral demand and supply shock. Now, you add fragmentation, you say, okay, now this term is already going to give me, when I have sectoral demand and supply shock, let me fragment the world. And what happens in that world to this term, you are also going to add this part to the term, which is going to be an extra cost coming to trade barriers. And we are going to fragment, and first of all, this work, the first equation, can match the inflation very well. This is 2021 inflation in United States and Euro, and you can see what actually happened. And the dots are what, comes out of our two-period model. And it's pretty successful even before you fragment the world, okay, to matching what happened. Just with sectoral supply, sectoral demand shocks, we also have an aggregate demand shocks in order to be able to match the extreme fiscal stimulus done, of course, in that year. Now, if you fragment the world, and let's say you fragment the world like that, this is totally exogenous. There are way more systematic papers doing this based on UN voting and everything. But imagine there is United States allies, rest of the world, China and Chinese allies, and the arrows is going to show you the trade between countries. If you go to this type of a counterfactual fragmentation, there are going to be serious employment effects, can go up to anywhere from 1% to 9%. But if you look at the US, maybe more so in other countries, but even if you look at the US, your relatively closed economy compared to other countries, there are going to be some serious drop in employment. Like 2% drop in employment in electronic sectors is going to be a pretty serious impact for the US economy. My final exercise is going to be the 2025 trade war. And we show that actually this type of global risk, even without retaliation, is going to create inflation persistence in the United States when you get full network into account, full network and the non-linear activities, and if the tariff uncertainty and tariff itself ends up being large. Now here, of course, we are going to need sticky prices and full dynamics in complete markets and monetary policy rules, because monetary policy is going to be extremely important in this setup. So this is going to generalize the new Keynesian open economy Leontief inverse, and we are going to apply it to 25 tariffs. Again, I don't want to go into the details of the equations, but this is a standard Leontief inverse, right? How you map to the sectoral shocks, to factors and consumption shares, to things like output and input. In our setup, it's not only that you are going to bring demand and stickiness, so this is upside down lambda triangle, which, Susan was mentioning this in her speech, how the demand is going to be affected. So not just immediate impact, but lingering effect. How do we understand that with consumer demand, investment demand? That is in here. But more importantly, once we have the monetary policy rules, labor and consumption shares come together with these matrices. Think this matrix as a Taylor rule matrix for the entire rule. Okay, so everybody's monetary policy, ECB, Federal Reserve, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, is going to be here. And it's going to be very, very important in this propagation. That's going to give me propagation through this new Keynesian open economy Leontief inverse, not just across sectors and countries, which is a typical object in the trade literature, but across time. Because of the propagation across time, I'm going to get inflation persistent in US, just because of the fact that I'm incorporating full network in a dynamic setup. Okay, here's a picture of that. So you can see the purple is going to be the full network model. The green is an SOE. If you treat United States as a small open economy, you are going to get very high inflation. Remember, the early inflation numbers estimated, most of them come from SOE model. And actually, you can even have a higher output because of the terms of trade gains. That's kind of the typical result in the literature. If you use our framework instead, the purple, not only that you are going to have a very large drop in the US because of the tariffs, and you're also going to have persistent inflation. Now, I'm not saying anything in terms of numbers here, because this is just a model comparison with numbers, right? This is not a serious quantitative work here, because I didn't put any tariff here. What happens if I put the actual tariffs? Now, you will appreciate it is really a heroic thing to do to track tariffs in 2025. At the Global Linkages Lab, actually, I have 4 undergraduate students at Brown tracking this day by day. And that's why I'm going to show you now, as of August, unfortunately, fall semester started, undergraduates are busy. So, and it's just like changing so fast. But this is basically, as of August, what is implemented. This is what is implemented, not what is announced. Okay? Of course, we take the announcement very seriously. Announcements come out of the White House. This is the announcement of the U.S. administration. So I'm also going to show you an impact of that, like just based on announcement, which is what we call tariff threats. This is what happened, what is implemented. As of August 2025, you can see a lot of sectors from China to U.S. as purple arrows. That means I put tariffs on that. The darker the purple color, larger the tariff on that good that is coming from that sector in China in red to my sector in blue. And you may not see this, but some of them is actually in high niche manufacturing here. So this is not just like t-shirts and the sneakers, but there's like really the advanced manufacturing that is also in the United States. That United States actually comparative advantage is going to be affected with these tariffs. This is a trade policy uncertainty. This is the Caldara Index and the Nick Bloom et al. Index. All policy uncertainty and the trade policy peaked around the Liberation Day event and then, come down, but still elevated. So we are also going to bring that in. So that's going to be our tariff threat shock. In the model, it's going to be like, you say you are going to do a tariff and then you take it back. Okay, that's how we are going to analyze it. Let me show you how different those shocks is, which is going to help us to understand why inflation didn't go as high as predicted originally. Because there's an inflationary shock as a cost push shock coming from the supply side, but there's also a deflationary shock that is, pressuring the prices coming from these uncertainties. So this is U.S. inflation, U.S. output. The actual tariff is going to increase inflation. The tariff threat is going to be deflationary. In terms of output, they are both going to decrease output, and in fact, the threat is going to decrease even more. This goes back to what Susan is saying. Well, consumers now are going to postpone their demand. Investors are going to say, let's stay and put and wait. That type of uncertainty is going to work exactly how the uncertainty shocks work in our models. Of course, here, once the tariff turns out to be not happening, the output effect goes away. Look at the exchange rate and the trade deficit. Trade deficit, of course, with actual tariff improves, right? Because you cut down on imports. But look at with tariff threats. With tariff threat, with uncertainty, actually trade deficit gets worsened. Why? Because of the front loading, right? Because you are going to think that, oh my God, they are coming tomorrow, let me just buy everything today. Which, can all be both inflationary and deflationary because it depends on how much you buy and how much intertemporally you also postpone. And look at the exchange rate. Of course, with an actual tariff, exchange rate is appreciate, dollar is going to appreciate. With a tariff threat, it's going to depreciate. Again, I can answer questions if we have time later, but this goes through, of course, a wedge in the international arbitrage condition, so which can match what happened during the Liberation Day event with the dollar depreciation. Now, my final slide, not happen again counterfactual, but I'm just trying to make the point that actually U.S. is not immune or isolated from these type of global risks, when these global risk is really at the sector country level and also can travel through this full-fledged networks of trade, production, and finance. This is a counterfactual shock, large tariffs, over 50% tariff on your key trading partners, not even everyone, and there is no retaliation. Again, with retaliation, you are going to get much worse numbers. There is no retaliation. Your key trading partners over 50%. A very key here, there is no monetary policy response. In the previous figure, you see that inflation goes up and down with actual tariff because there is a Taylor rule, immediately adjusts to that inflationary response. So, that's why inflation is not long-lived. Here, monetary policy does nothing, and this is how you get inflation persistence, of course. Look at the number now. I was showing you 0.6 inflation. This is 6% inflation in the United States. And it's lasting over 12 quarters. So very much what we observed with 9% inflation during the pandemic prelude to these type of shocks. And there are other countries here, Europe, China, and all that. And of course, you do see trade diversion. You see that trade is now diverted to Europe. This is so output in Europe increases. Employment in Europe increases. Of course, it drops in U.S. and also a lot of large consumption drop in the U.S. Takeaways. So we are developing a new framework with multi-layer networks, meaning we have the full-fledged trade network, full-fledged production network, domestic and international, and also capital flows. The last exercise I showed you are with incomplete markets, matching the net capital flows and also at the same time net foreign asset position of the United States. When you do that, this is the key to understand U.S. exposure to global risks. Once nonlinear, indirect, and the second round linkage is accounted for, U.S. exposure is much larger than the standard model suggests. That is going to pin this down with either the trade shares or the dollar rates, right? 2025 tariffs is going to be a very eye-opening exercise if you use actually what happened, and of course, with exemptions and with things removed, the tariffs right now we have, even in November, are actually much smaller than what is announced in April. So that actual tariff is going to give you 0.2 to 0.5 percentage point inflation and 1% drop in output in the long run. But in a counterfactual scenario, inflation can be as high as 6% with persistent up to 12 quarters if you have tariffs over 50% on key trading partners, which was basically what was announced in April. The policy implication is very clear. The final impact of all these shocks, especially shocks like tariff, is going to depend on monetary policy. But broadly, preserving a financially stable, open to trade international ecosystem is going to be the best self-insurance for the United States in the face of global risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shabnam. And now we have Aaron Flan to discuss the paper.
Great. Thank you, Sebnem. It's really great to be here to discuss this great work. And in case it wasn't clear, this is an enormous body of work spanning several papers, hundreds of pages, all with many applications and scenarios that are really unique to policymakers. I think you'd be forgiven for wondering whether there may be more than one person with the exact same last name, because Sebnem seems to be everywhere all at once. And certainly from the Federal Reserve System, we are greedily consuming the output that she has, simply because it's always on these very policy-relevant topics. And the topic certainly is a central one. Global supply chains have really played a leading role in many of the economic storylines of the past decade. from the tariffs in the first Trump administration, COVID, the post-COVID supply chain snarls, and then, of course, right now in 2025 with the second round of tariffs as well. And I think for those that are kind of looking into these models, you quickly realize that the details really matter for how these things work. The multi-country, multi-industry, and then particularly those multi-country industry output tables that are factored in are really crucial. But what I think that this framework uniquely brings in are those factor supply shocks, allowing, I think, the very real-world feature that you're often operating off of the first best equilibrium in the interior of the production possibilities frontier. And that's what's so unique and so uniquely useful in what SEBNEM's framework has to offer. And so, my ambitions here are going to be quite modest. I really just want to offer 3 thoughts on, I think, ways to interpret what she's already doing, potentially extend a few things so that they would, again, provide some additional utility to policymakers in the present environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk and rare earths, direction flows and data, and then capacity and constraints. So certainly for a period of 3 weeks in October, I think all that we were thinking about was rare earths and the world in which rare earths could be affecting global supply chains. And the question we had was, what would be these macroeconomic effects if these global export restrictions were severe, affecting global industry? And I think, if you follow the history of the literature on a topic like this going back several decades, you would actually go back to this theorem from Holton that would say that, well, the impact's going to be simply just the aggregate sales share of the industry in shock. So that's that Domar weight that SEBNEM was talking about. If that's true, well, the global market for rare earths is like $5 to $10 billion. So the answer would be effectively 0. And that would be your answer. Now, if you fast forward to some of the work that was highlighted in Bakai and Farhi, is that, well, it's actually more complicated than that in a production network framework. That you actually need to take that Domar weight of the Chinese rare earths and interact it with the industries that it connects to in the production network, but then crucially scaled by those elasticities of substitution. Okay, and that's in the unique ways in which it interacts with others in the production network. And here I think is where what's really being captured here is the essence of risks in this production network, because we have a world in which that Domar weight for Chinese rare earths is very close to 0. But because that these Chinese, these sourced rare earths are unique in their chemistry and are universal in their applications, we have a lot of instances in which those elasticities of substitution for many connections are going to be very close to 0. So you have a numerator close to 0, you have a denominator close to 0. So we're in the very lovely position of being able to tell our principals that the answer to this question could be anywhere from 0 to the complete shutdown of the U.S. industrial sector. Okay, that's an uncomfortable position to be in. And so some of the questions I have for SEBNEM is, how can we use your framework to help us think about and perhaps illustrate the risks associated with this kind of situation where we know the Domar weight's very small for rare earths. And we know that those elasticities of substitution are also low, but we don't know exactly how low they are. In this case, having a 0.1, 0.01, 0.0001 really is going to matter for scaling up or down those macroeconomic impacts. And so it might just be a way of illustrating the risk about how our uncertainty in those parameters might impact what we care about. The second question is, look, SEBNEM is using the state-of-the-art, the best available data for global multi-country input-output tables, these ICIO tables from the OECD. But even the best available data, their data is at the 3-digit NAICS categories. So you're thinking of like 332 NAICS fabricated metals. Whereas Chinese rare earths are in the North American Product Classification System, the NAPS, and there it's a 10, 11-digit product category, where even there, all Chinese rare earth metals are in that single category, where you've got the neodymium and the dysprosium all in that one category. And so there we're trying to think about how would aggregation bias work, where you have the 3-digit industries, but actually it's really only one sliver of output and uses in that 3-digit industry that could be the central category. And so how should we think about the elasticity of substitution when they are an aggregation of these smaller pieces. So I do want to offer some useful help here. One thing that I found really promising is that buried in an appendix in some USGS material are these really useful appendices that identify over 70 unique applications of rare earths affecting 35 or so detailed 6-digit BEA industries. And not only that, but they actually identify what fraction of the output of that industry uses these Chinese-sourced rare earths and in what fashion. And so you can imagine that this is a way of actually splitting out the input-output tables to take that one sector and then be able to feed it through into all of these industries in a better way. And I know that some other folks are probably using this. I know Laura Alfaro has this paper looking at innovation with Chinese rare earths, so they may be already familiar with this. But I think this could be potentially very useful for us in this particular topic. Okay, second, I want to talk a little bit about direction flows and data. We often talk about the production network in these models, but this network also has a flow from upstream to downstream, and it matters when these shocks affect either an upstream category or a downstream category. And so Sebnem's framework can really think about this and how it matters for how the shocks then propagate through. And I also think it matters for the transmission flow, but also for then the timing. How would a shock matter in the timing of when it would eventually flow through to something that we measure like CPI, if it's really upstream versus substantially further downstream. So she has the framework to help us think through this. And I'll just give you one example from the 2018 tariffs on steel. You can see here tariffs were recommended, tariffs were applied. And even if you just look at the steel PPI during this time period, you see a very clear jump in the PPI following tariffs being implemented, much like you would expect. But then what you also see is downstream impacts of those prices as the price of fabricated metals moves up, and then further downstream the price of machinery moves up. And so thinking about the relative timing, the relative magnitudes of those, we can kind of do this same theoretical exercise with her model that you can see here in the data. And I think that could be really useful for us as well. So finally, let me talk about capacity and constraints. So capacity constraints are one of those really difficult things to capture in models, but we know it exists and we know it's important. So rapid demand shifts during COVID resulted in firms rapidly hitting short-run capacity constraints where they could not and actually did not want to expand capacity, knowing that some of these demand shocks were indeed temporary. What results is that those subsequent disruptions then cascade downstream and upstream as other firms do not have sufficient materials to produce the demand that is offered for their particular industry. And so I'm trying to think about how the framework she has with these unique factor supply constraints might actually be able to kind of capture in a reduced form way those capacity constraints. And then I'm thinking about how then it would follow through with potentially endogenously hitting other capacity constraints downstream, upstream when firms do not have sufficient materials. Maybe some of this is also captured in the elasticity of substitution in a reduced form way, but I think I'd like to better understand how her model really could capture some of these things. So once again, I want to provide a little bit of help, some data on this topic as well. I think I want to highlight this really, I think, an overlooked resource on this topic, and that comes from the quarterly survey of plant capacity. It's a survey that's jointly funded by the Federal Reserve Board. That's why I think it's really useful. What this survey asks, it asks plants, what is your full production capability? And then what are you currently operating at right now? So you can get at their utilization rate. So for some plants, you can see they're currently operating at their full production capacity. But when they say that they're not, it asks the plants, why are you not operating at full production capacity? In normal times, 80% of the plants say, I have insufficient demand, insufficient orders. But what you can also ask these plants is, they can respond saying, I have insufficient supply of labor, I have insufficient materials. And these latter two were, of course, very prominent during the COVID and post-COVID supply chain period that you can see here. So you can see that firms citing insufficient labor were like 10% in normal times. They jump up to nearly 50% of firms citing this during the COVID period. And then I think even more notably, more like 5% of firms will ever cite having insufficient materials to produce the needed demand, and that jumps up to 40% or so. And this is critical because this is saying, firms are saying, I would like to produce more, but I can't because I don't have enough materials to do so. So this is really useful variation that could be exploited and mapped into a modeling framework. So let me just give you one other example of how this plays out. What I'm plotting here are steel lead times. So this is like if I put an order into a steel plant, what's the lead time for which I would get that? You can see the spikes, and this goes from in the 4 to 5 week range to over 10 during this post-COVID supply chain. And what's happening here is that right at COVID, steel plants thought we're in a major recession. There's going to be a decline in durable good orders, so we're going to shut down production. So a lot of these blast furnaces shut down. Well, very quickly they learned that actually we're going to get a surge in demand for durable goods during COVID, and so they very quickly tried to restart these blast furnaces. It takes a long time to restart a blast furnace, in the months, to get them going back and getting consistent heat and production operations again. And so in the response, they were lagging behind in terms of their supply of steel to the U.S. market. And so this was a historically high lead times for steel. So as you would expect, steel prices jump. I'm plotting here actually the hot-rolled coil, which is one of the benchmark series for steel, and it skyrockets during this time, as we would all expect. But the thing that you can see is that when you look then downstream, you see this big jump in downstream firms. Here I'm looking at fabricated metals, highlighting we have insufficient materials, we're not able to produce as much as we would like. So again, it's these cascading production network effects due to limited supply of materials. So those are my main comments. I do just want to emphasize that what Sebnem's doing here is policy relevant research, at its finest. It's our profession working at its finest for really answering these very timely questions in ways that people that are engaged in policy can actually act on. So it's the right type of model to capture these production networks, and as is typical, the rest of the world, including the data, just need to catch up with Sebnem. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. So I think before we turn into the audience for questions, Sebnem, if you want to take a few minutes to respond to Aaron's comments.
Of course, no. Can everybody hear me? It's good? Okay. No, this is great. Thank you so much. I fully agree with everything Aaron's saying. And we do have a data problem. This is exactly the limitation, right? The framework is flexible enough that you can not only incorporate layers of elasticities, also a firm level input-output network, right? You can do this actually. Given the the computer power we have, if you have this subpar sector to sector data at the firm level, you can definitely do much better. Same thing for the elasticities, right? Elasticity is going to be also very important here, as Aaron said. This goes back to Aaron's work on the Japanese earthquake, Andre's work here. So we use your elasticities, right? So we are limited by both, like by the elasticities you guys estimate and tell us, and by the input-output linkages, OECD or BA tell us, right? If we improve on those two, the models are there, definitely. And in fact, I'm tired of waiting this data catching up. This is what we do at the Global Linkages Lab right now. We are trying to create and estimate these things at a very granular level, so we can get at the timings of all those things you show. This survey, when we did the first paper actually I was presenting at January 2021, when nobody was talking about these things at WHO, and saying like, look, showing these type of survey result, not from the US but the Europe, because European one, very similar one, goes back to actually 1999. So we can actually make a point like, look, they always said insufficient demand. Look now what they are saying, right? Even like early 2021, insufficient labor, insufficient material. So we showed all these things, and then we say, okay, what is the best way to model this? All these models now, we have many of them, this, inflationary effect of the, high demand in a supply-constrained world, which goes back to the conclusion of our 2022 ECB Sintra paper. Many of us model it differently, right? With capacity constraint, with, vertical factor, all those. But at that point, because we look at those surveys from Europe, because data was there, we realized, okay, the best way to model this is going to be through the sector factor supply, because that is our best chance to measure these things, right? That's our best chance. So, because the idea is always like, what is the most flexible model I do so I can take it to the data so I can quantify. But the big work here is to do is definitely do more of those velocities and more firm-to-firm networks. Let me make it very clear. The practice right now is estimate these things at a very micro level, very well identified. I can do it for the steel, I can do it for the rebars, coils, and all that, and then stick these things in the macro models, right? I think we should evolve that for the policy and for the general economic implication. We have to do them together within the same model. So we definitely need to have those estimates at the granular level and less aggregation than just like a 4-digit sector. But the model we wrote down is flexible. It can definitely do that. It's just a data limitation.
Great, thank you. So let's take some questions. If you could please raise your name tag when you're posing the question, I will collect a few to start with. So why don't we go with Alan Sinai first, and please wait for the microphone so that folks online can hear you, and state your name first.
So, Alan Sinai, Decision Economics. I share the enthusiasm of the author, Sebnem, for the model, the framework, and the use of it. It's stunning, it's innovative. It should be part of the equipment and tools of policymakers, especially when we have so many external shocks. And if you look at history, we have more external shocks than we don't. And our profession doesn't really analyze it well. Also, I will share the applause of Aaron's comments on your work. It's great. Now, I do have a question. It's a bottom line question I would ask as a policymaker if I were a policymaker. What does the framework say, because you did deal with the tariffs, about whether the inflationary effects of the tariffs, which you showed us have been very minor so far, are one-time or permanent? One-time or permanent? I think that's a question Federal Reserve Board members have been asking. Conclusion, one time. Do you agree with that, using your apparatus?
Do I answer, or?
I think I'll collect a couple more. Tommaso Monticelli, please.
Okay, so this was very interesting work, as usual, from Sebnem. So I have 3 small points. So first of all, just to understand, so here you're thinking and talking about risk, but you're talking about first moment shocks, right? That then scale not linearly through production and finance networks, right? So, but I guess you can also think of second moment shocks at different niches of, so uncertainty shocks in different parts of the global economy. The second is that point is that so you're thinking of different sources of risk in a, I guess, in a uncorrelated way, but there is even more of an argument to think that, let's say, trade protectionism risk is highly correlated to geopolitical risk. And actually, one could even think that we could go, if we take seriously, as we should, I think, these new insights from geoeconomics, right, that these 2 dimensions are endogenously related, and so that this risk are not uncorrelated, right? So that brings more food for thought and analysis for quantification. And the last point is, I just was wondering, what role do financial markets here play, and the lack or thereof of perfection in completeness in financial markets, right? So if these shocks are global in nature, right, they're sort of not diversifiable, and to what extent do they propagate differently depending on, possible different degrees of financial market integration? So I'd like to know, since you had many moving parts, what is the role of financial markets in propagating or not global shocks, and not only global shocks, but also granular shocks that may derive from some particular sectors or some particular country.
Okay. Why don't you answer those 2, and then I'll collect some more.
Okay, so for the first question, this is absolutely very important. This whole, is it a one-time price jump, and is it going to be a persistent inflationary impulse? This depends monetary policy, what the monetary policy does. That's why I showed that one equation, but not just the U.S. monetary policy, but the entire, trading partners' monetary policy. Now, if, the monetary policy adjusts in all these countries according to Taylor rule, and again, this is incorporating the countries might have different mandates, price stability, maximum employment, or just price stability, different Taylor rule coefficients, taking that, then you can definitely generate a result of a one-time price jump, right? But if the monetary policy not responds, or not responds in the way that is, put in the model with a Taylor rule, then you can have inflation persistence. And that can be not just like one quarter. We showed in the extreme case, it can be up to 12 quarters. So it really comes back to Federal Reserve, but also other central banks, of course, mostly here Federal Reserve. Let me make this very clear. This whole, one-time price and it goes away, transitory thing is a very much a standard, complete market, small open economy, thinking, right? Once you bring this full network structure into a dynamic New Keynesian model, which is what you guys use to do monetary policy, then things started changing. Policy has absolutely a first order impact. We have a positive paper here. We don't do normative analysis. We don't talk about optimal policy, but it's absolutely going to determine that final result. That is it a one-time price or inflation. It's very important.
That's a huge innovation, what you just said, bringing in this framework, thinking about it outside the normal standard way of thinking. It's very, very important.
Thank you. We are hoping journals will appreciate that too, but I'm very happy that you guys appreciate this innovation. All right, okay. Tommaso, yes, the first moment and the second moment, and this is exactly, I went back to Susan's speech. We want to capture both, and that's why I showed you the policy uncertainty figures for trade and economic policy. On the first two applications, the pandemic and the inflation and geopolitical, we did the first moment. You're exactly right, and I showed you the model solved non-linearly, but I show you, just to give you the intuition, a first order approximation. But in the tariff fund, we didn't do it like that. We do exactly like you're saying. There's a first moment shock, there's a second moment shock. And the technology here we are using is actually this, the now over 20 years of work in the financial side of the literature, where we have these wedges in the arbitrage, in the UIP equation, and those are second moment shocks. You can put them as a level shocks into the UIP equation as an exogenous intermediation wedge, or you can fully endogenize that as a volatility shock. And I have a paper with Özge Akıncı and Albert Queralto, showing exactly how to do that. Now, we in that final exercise I showed you, that's how it entered. That's why actually not only you get depreciation, you can actually even match the depreciation, right? By playing with that volatility on the innovation. So that's very important. The second question you have, the geopolitical, yes, I mean this is my second exercise, that there is a geopolitical fragmentation. Let me just clarify a couple of things, because I'm a little bit confused in this literature. Now, geopolitics is again, goes back to the 1940s. That's why I put Hirschman and Kindleberger, right? We want to focus more on the Kindleberger side. I mean, Jeff Frieden is here, so he can correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe the new literature on geoeconomics is more focusing on the Hirschman side. So, there are trade asymmetries and dependencies, and if you're a large country who can manipulate terms of trade, you can use this geopolitical leverage. So the new literature is giving us a very useful framework how to do that. How U.S. can apply pressure on China versus Europe, which pressure, which threat more credible and all that, right? Okay, which is great. I mean, so I'm a big fan of putting the things that really, we know since 1940s, kind of in our modern equation setup, so we can see, okay, how you can do this, how a hegemon can do this, which is great. What we are trying to say is U.S. can do this, China can do this. That's the whole rare earth saga. This is why Aaron spent all those times to think about that, right? Any country can do this. Remember my first figure. This is our point. Maybe it is time to think about it now, a bipolar world. Maybe we have two hegemons. I don't know, right? I mean, we are not trying to model that process, or we are not trying to say, are we going to a two-currency, two-country hegemon world? This is great. I mean, I really like those type of work. What we are trying to do, if this is happening, and say there are frameworks who can tell us more how this is happening, we want to make the point that, look, this is going to come back to you if you also use it yourself. If you do any geopolitical pressure, you use any leverage because of the fact that you're a large country, you issue the world's reserve currency, you name it. If you use these things, this is going to come back to you in terms of instability, in terms of, the global risks coming out of this process is going to, make you unstable. That's Charles Kindleberg's point. That's like very explicit in his 1941 National Association Act. So that's the point. And to your third point related, these things are correlated. That's completely fine. Again, my first picture, that it can be in US, it can be in China, it can be in the middle, right? But this is what the dynamics gives us. And this also goes back to Aaron's point, which is super important, right? Depending on, when you hit that price and then how you are going to see in the PPI index. This all goes back to go very granular and think about how I aggregate it. That's when this sector versus firm, which elasticity comes into question, 0.1 versus 0.0 makes a big difference. But also in the sense that, okay, as long as correlations are not perfectly correlated, which would be an alien invasion of the world, anything else is going to be, this timing is critical, right? I mean, even with the pandemic, not every country went through the bomb, the bust and the boom at the same time, right? We also, you would say, a correlated shock, right? So in that sense, that is not a worry, but that is a gain for our framework, because we have a framework flexible enough exactly get at that. In fact, now the data we are collecting to bring all these elasticities and input-output at the firm level, telling us these very interesting things. Another example similar to Aaron, but very relevant right now is rebar. Rebar is an input that United States import. It goes to every single construction project in this country. If we are going to build all sorts of AI, electricity, centers, which we are already building, the investment growth in the United States right now is completely driven with the capex in the AI sector. We need these rebars. If you look at that PPI item, exactly as Aaron's showing, the rebar price in the PPI increased 14%. We have a 35% increase in our data. And when we, talked to these supply chain managers, they said they didn't, fill the orders at that price, yes, because of inventories, right? Now, next order is going to be filled at that price. So this also going to give you, how slowly these things are going to come back to the inflation, which, again, the framework captures. So I think it's not about correlated shocks or idiosyncratic shock is messing up the timing. That's not the case. What will get the timing right, exactly in the figures Aaron's showing, that we get the elasticities and the linkages at a more micro level, and at the same time use that in the quantification of this model. The model is flexible enough and allowed.
Okay. Great. So I think we'll go to Paul Antras next, and then Mary after him.
Paul Antras, Harvard. It's a great presentation. It's a bit of a specific question, but if you could elaborate a bit on what is behind the contractionary effect of tariffs in the second and third examples. Where I'm coming from is, at least on the trade side, the models you work with typically generate very large optimal tariffs. So when we're looking at a setting like the current one, where we're largely in a situation where the US has been raising tariffs on just about everybody else, and only China has retaliated, it's a little bit hard for me to make sense of why actually real GDP is contracting in your model. So I don't know if it's the Chinese retaliation, or is it the nominal rigidity aspect of the model? But that was not very clear to me.
No, this is a very, very good question. In fact, when we present at EFG in summer, Oleg was asking us, and so we work on this since then. So optimal tariff is definitely not zero in this model, right? If you work it out. We are not doing it, but yes, United States as a large country manipulate terms of trade in its favor should have a non-zero tariff. But having said that, two things change that classic result. One is, of course, the general equilibrium instead of a small open economy. If I model the US as a small open economy, I'm definitely going to get higher consumption, higher output, everything, because you are going to get, the full terms of trade manipulation, appreciation, all that. But more importantly, the stickiness, price stickiness interaction, new Keynesian setup, interacting with that global general equilibrium, right? You can say, well, you could have done it in two country too, which is correct. Actually, Kendrogov and Murray Opsahl have an earlier paper making this case. In a two-country general equilibrium, there can be also a negative impact. But here, we maximize that not only because we have multi-country, the multi-country stickiness gets into the picture. We have a sectoral stickiness, right? So the services more sticky than manufacturing and energy, and that is putting here not just for the U.S. but also, for the Canada, Mexico, and all. And we also have this bilateral rigidity to get at this pricing. So that makes the Phillips curve flatter. An insight originally actually goes back to Elissa Rubo's work, right? I mean, to make the Phillips curve flatter with the price stickiness, we kind of extend that insight to an open economy framework, especially with this heterogeneity in the sectoral price stickiness now becomes country sector. Then it matters, of course, where you put the tariff. In fact, we have an exercise in the paper now, which is really neat. We look at the steel and aluminum tariffs, and we kind of scale it based on how much you import. It doesn't matter how much you import, right? You import more from China or more from Mexico. We normalize that, and we show different inflation and different output impact depending on just steel and aluminum put on Mexico and Canada, steel and aluminum, or Chinese steel and aluminum. And you are exactly right that you can get a less output drop or almost nothing depending on how that stickiness is going to factor in. Overall, though, with the existing tariffs, this is very important. We have a stagflationary impulse on everyone, right? That's, I think, also a unique result to our paper.
Mary Amiti from the New York Fed. First of all, I'm very happy to see a macro model not coming to the conclusion that trade just doesn't matter. So I really like the fact that you've brought in these networks. But my question, it's a bit related to Paul's, is that we have tariffs on outputs and inputs, and the output tariffs are supposed to benefit the domestic producers, and the input tariffs hurting them. And it seemed like most of your work was kind of focusing on the input tariff, and so I was curious about, like, is there anything in the model that does give you kind of the benefits that the standard theories would predict from the output tariffs, or is it that just that they're there but they're kind of overshadowed by the input tariffs? So that's kind of like in the model. But then then related to what Aaron was saying in terms of the disaggregation. When you have fairly aggregated input-output tables, it's kind of very difficult to separate the input from the output tariff. So I was just wondering, how that would affect the kind of numbers that you're coming up with.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And again, this is combining now with Paul's questions. I can even give a broader answer. We can definitely generate higher U.S. consumption, higher output, right? I mean, it is very easy to generate that result. And also, this is a combination of a short-run New Keynesian macro model with a long-run standard trade model. So we are going to match all the standard trade insight in flex price long-run equilibrium. Okay, that goes without saying. But in the short run, what we are focusing inflation output trade-off, and how in this world it's going to be very difficult for central banks, what to do. Exactly because the tariffs put like that, right? I mean, on input-output, which becomes input-output, and that's what the tariffs put. Remember that figure with all those purple arrows. Now, we tested the model on 2018 tariffs, which wasn't like that, right? I mean, this is unique to this year where you do multi-sector, multi-countries. But if you just do like one country, given that level of tariff, not any uncertainty or anything, we actually match results from your work and any other work. And there's a lot of work on empirical work, very well identified empirical work, yours and others, on the 2018. So we kind of did a road test of the model. Let's just do that, and then we actually match what the empirical literature, both on the micro side and macro side, found, right? The point we are trying to make is like, okay, look, this is a model that can, handle if it is done this way. And again, there is so much uncertainty, right? Maybe there's a court case going on. Maybe we will end up something at the end of 2025 or 2026 like 2018 case, right? And we can then definitely go back to more benign effects. But the point of my presentation, the question asked to me, how these global risks, so far affect and might affect in the future So this is why, we do all those counterfactuals. And again, as of August tariffs, you are going to deviate from the 2018 scenario, because if you look at what has been done by August, it is quite a lot and quite extensive in its cross-sector country dimension. Yeah, but you're exactly right.
So we'll go to Carly next, and then Steve Leisman after.
Is it on? Great. Thank you, Shebna. Really interesting, ambitious work, as usual, swinging for the fences. I look forward to reading the paper, which is my way of begging your indulgence if the question that I'm about to ask is squarely addressed in the paper. I'm really sympathetic to the idea that the U.S. is less insulated than we've historically assumed. And one of the sources of insulation is dollar dominance and the centrality of the treasury market in global financial markets. And you highlighted dollar dominance in your motivation. In the paper, if at all, how do dollar dominance, U.S. Treasury centrality, and safe asset demand play into insulation or lack thereof, or changes therein, right? So as we contemplate the consequences of exorbitant privilege lost or convenience lost, what can your framework tell us about the implications for global connection and spillovers to the United States?
Yes, this is super important, because we look at that two ways. First of all, because we have imbalanced trade, incomplete markets model, the one that I used for the tariffs, we actually match the U.S. net foreign asset position, right? So, and all the other countries. So that is there. Now, there is risk sharing, but there is incomplete. In fact, the difference in our inflation numbers to the complete market models that originally, I don't know if you remember, were very, very high, is exactly that. Because there is, even it's incomplete, there is some sort of, through the movement of the capital flow, smoothing out, which smooths out, the impact on U.S. because U.S. receives more inflows, right? I mean, just based on, even with the, decline in imports, still U.S. is going to be a net borrower, right? I mean, so that's okay. So that definitely helps, because without that, you are going to have way bigger appreciation of the dollar, way, bigger inflation impact coming from the bond. So that disciplines that, so it kind of puts that type of insulation in. Now, the dollar dominance, we have obviously, we don't have that much detail that, we have, okay, let me take it back. We have the detail that we do two different pricing, producer currency pricing and the dollar currency pricing, right? And the dollar currency pricing also, smooths out the pass-through, right? So that the kind of dollar dominance goes through already the pass-through, right? Because with producer currency pricing, you have higher pass-through. With the dollar currency pricing, it's going to be lower pass-through. Now, but you can go further. You can say, well, dollar dominance is not just dollar pricing, but everything being in dollars, trade transaction, financial transaction, reserve asset, and all that. Okay, so that, the only thing we can look at, what if this changes type of, are we going to a new world? Is the dollar depreciation we've seen in April is really a kind of a, emerging market case, or what happened to United Kingdom during the Brexit event and also the mini budget distrust event, capital flow out, you are dumping the assets. Okay, A, first of all, we didn't see that in the United States. But B, the easiest way to work that through is the wedge in the international arbitrage condition, in the UIP wedge, right? So that you can really make it that you are making dollar as risky currency, like any other currencies instead of a safe currency. We didn't go that far, but of course, that type of wedge helps us to match what happened in the data. I mean, you can definitely do more than that, but at least in terms of, right, U.S. is receiving capital flows in net, and trade is priced in the dollar, that we incorporated. Yep.
I'm always a little reluctant to ask a question in a venue like this, because to show my ignorance, but I'm not proud. So I get the classic explanation that if you look at trade as a percent of GDP in the U.S. doesn't amount to much, but all you got to do is cover a couple of global financial crises to realize that is a completely inadequate explanation for how the U.S. is linked to the world. I'm just wondering if you could explain how your research finds why that is inadequate. What actual economic forces are at work that amplify the U.S. linkages to the rest of the world? And if the answer is networks, I wonder if you can go just a little deeper than that. Thank you.
Okay, so no, you're exactly right, because that type of thinking overall looks at how much you buy. But then from the financial cases, we've seen that actually contagion can be very quick, right? So how do I bring those two worlds together, right? That's in a way what you're asking. And then the way is really understanding behind every trade transaction, regardless it's a final good or it's an intermediate input, there is a financing transaction. And the economic mechanism is that in a multilateral world where both of those links are very, very tight, even U.S. has a special role in those links, one being very strong and center finance, and the other one is like, maybe not that much important because my trade is low. They still have to come together in global general equilibrium, okay, I'm not going to use jargon, in global world, okay, if you kick out the general equilibrium, right? Meaning, every single price and exchange rate has to adjust relative to each other. And that's going to, of course, involve how trade maybe changes. And maybe if you are not buying that much at the first place, you can be insulated. But also how the portfolios and the capital flows are changing, right? So I mean, we always talk about, okay, now say the Apple, they are going to now not only going to do China, but they are going to open India. And there are third connector countries, everything going to go to Vietnam and Indonesia. Well, I mean, did we ask also the other guys, like, how they are financing this? What is the portfolio flow change behind those changes? So that's the way you think about economics, right? These things are linked. You cannot just think one inseparable from the other. I mean, that's the short answer. I can give you a longer answer with more details. I don't know how much details you want.
Maybe during the break, that's coming up next. So that concludes our first session today, and we're going to a break and reconvening at 11 o'clock. Thank you.
Now at the ECB, so the usual disclaimers in that vein applies. So let me start by saying that I'm going to show you two facts about inflation and supply chains that pertain to the 21-23 high inflation period. So the first fact that I'm going to point out is that during that time span, 21-23, energy and CPI inflation here, both in the US and in the euro area, accelerated in tandem. So in red, you see the CPI inflation. In blue, you see energy inflation. If you're wondering, this is more in a more detailed way, plots the rolling covariance between energy and CPI inflation. And so after 2020, this covariance sort of rose significantly. At the same time, that's fact number two, during that period, we observed a large increase in the degree of uncertainty in supply chains. Okay, so this is going to be mostly a paper about supply chain uncertainty. And so how do we measure supply chain uncertainty? Here we plot two measures. On the left, you see the rolling variance of the GS-CPI index, the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. It's a broad index of different measures of transportation costs that is compiled by the New York Fed. And on top of that, there are also PMI indicators. So on the left, you do see the variance increasing significantly in the period. On the right, you see another measure of supply chain uncertainty. So if you think of the first as an objective measure of uncertainty in supply chains, here, think of a measure of perceived uncertainty in supply chains. This is the so-called ETU index. This is an index based on text analysis across three main semantic class of words: energy, transportation, and uncertainty. Right. So think again of this as a measure of perceived uncertainty in supply chains. So regardless of the measure, you do see a significant increase in the period. So let me just add that, so with Alfonso, we are in the process of actually compiling a third measure of supply chain uncertainty that, if you want, is more granular and based on firms' earnings call, right? So we accessed a data set that allows us to do text analysis on how relevant supply chain uncertainty was for firms in that period, but not only in that period in general. So we're going to argue that these two facts are intimately related, right? That supply chain uncertainty, however measured, actually bears an important implication on the transmission of energy price shocks to inflation. So in order to introduce some causal flavor to this question, right? So not only unconditionally talk about energy price inflation and CPI inflation, let me show you the result of a first set of empirical exercises. So here we run local projections of, on the left-hand side, your preferred measure of inflation, headline or core inflation, on a measure of oil supply news shocks. This is an instrument that comes from a high-frequency identification procedure in a nice paper by Diego Kenzik. And here we add an interaction term via dummy dt. This dummy dt is, takes the value of 1 when the variance of the GS CPI index, our baseline measure of uncertainty in supply chains that I showed before, but things would be robust if we were to use the other index. So when the variance of the GS CPI index is in the top 20 percentile. Right? And so here are the basic results, okay? So on top US, at the bottom you see the euro area, on the left you see headline inflation, on the right you see core inflation. These are the responses over time of inflation to an oil news supply shock, our proxy of a suitably identified energy shock, exogenous shock. And you see two regimes. You see the blue case is the case in which the variance of supply chain, the uncertainty in supply chain is low, okay? Whereas in the red case, you do see a regime of high supply chain uncertainty measured as I said before, as those states of the world when the variance of the GS CPI index is in the top 20 or top 10 percentile. Okay, so here, this is causal evidence that the pass-through of inflation of oil news shocks is significantly larger, conditional on high supply chain uncertainty. So our main idea, and now I'm going to introduce you to the core sort of theoretical argument. Our main idea is that supply chain uncertainty amplifies the pass-through of energy price shocks ultimately to inflation. And so in order to give you the core idea of the theory behind this, so let me provide a qualitative description without getting into the details of the model in the interest of time. So what is the core mechanism in our environment? So think of a background where the economy is hit by two typology of shocks. So some shocks are IID, purely energy price shocks, right? And at the same time, persistent transportation shocks. Transportation shocks will be our proxy for supply chain disruptions. Firms in the economy use two inputs that are shipped on the same route. Okay, this is very important. So this is the reason why supply chains may be subject to choke points, for example. And then there is a large empirical evidence that both the several different inputs are shipped through the same naval rights. 80% of trade goes through maritime routes. So firms use two inputs, different in logic. So one is energy, which is a highly commoditized, homogeneous good, okay? And the other, think of the other as a specialized input. For the sake of clarity, think of that as microchips, right? I'm going to think of energy and microchips. So then all of a sudden, a transportation disruption in supply chain hits, right? So here we're very general. Here this picture shows a real episode, like the choke point in the Suez Canal of 2 years ago. The Evergreen ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, and surprisingly enough, although the situation was resolved in a matter of days, the ripple effects on the supply chain in terms of transportation disruption actually continued for months. Okay, this is a limit case, but of course, we're thinking of transportation disruptions as originating from, like, COVID, the pent-up increase in demand after COVID that produced a strong pressure on supply chains, or, when a year and a half ago, Israel attacked Iran, right? So that generated a lot of uncertainty through the Strait of Hormuz, okay, where a lot of ships actually transit, right? And because there the Houthi rebels were just generating this extra degree of uncertainty. So we're thinking generally of choke points or transportation shocks. The key element is that if these shocks are sufficiently large, the transportation capacity constraint becomes binding. Okay, so think of COVID, extra increase in pent-up demand, and just supply and production cannot keep up, and so the transportation capacity constraint becomes binding. So this generates an important asymmetry between the two inputs. So while energy, which is a very commoditized good, right, that is exchanged in very liquid markets, remains available physically, despite energy being stuck on the same ship with the microchip, but you locally can always source energy, although at a higher cost, of course, because of the transportation shock. Microchips instead face a stochastic delivery delay, right? So, and that is going to impact your expected marginal cost, and you're going to have to estimate a component of your marginal cost which is actually uncertain, okay? Because of uncertainty in the delivery of the specialized input that we call the microchip. And so, since energy prices are very information sensitive, right? They aggregate information in a relatively efficient way, right? So they are very responsive to true transportation disruptions. And so they provide a good signal for firms, right, in solving the inference problem that is at the heart of this model, meaning estimating how long it's going to take for the microchip to be shipped, right? And how long this impact on marginal cost is going to play out. So firms in this environment are going to use the price of energy as a noisy signal. Why noisy? It's a good signal on the one hand because energy prices aggregate information efficiently, and they truly reflect the underlying transportation shock, okay? But on the other hand, energy prices are noisy signals because remember in this environment, there are some primitive IID energy price shocks that are hitting the economy. So firms, in using energy prices as a signal, they're going to partly misinterpret, okay, changes in energy prices as being sort of due to underlying transportation disruptions. So the inference problem is at the heart of our analysis. So firms are going to solve a Bayesian signal extraction problem. And so this is where supply chain uncertainty plays a role. The larger is the degree of supply chain uncertainty, right? The more firms are going to rely on energy prices as a signal, right, of true underlying supply chain disruptions in order to estimate, right, how long it's going to take for the microchip to be shipped, right, and in order to estimate what is ultimately the effect on their perceived marginal cost. Right, so we're going to show that this, the higher degree of uncertainty in supply chain is going to raise the perceived marginal cost beyond the direct pass-through of a change in energy prices. And this is going to hold both in a static way, meaning any given change in energy prices, right, is going to affect marginal cost beyond the energy share in production, okay? And this effect is going to be larger. The larger is the degree of supply chain uncertainty, precisely because with high uncertainty in supply chain, which we're going to proxy as the variance of transportation shocks in this model, firms are going to rely more on energy prices as signals, right, to estimate the observed delivery delay on the microchip. And then this amplification, or this pass-through amplification from energy prices onto output prices is going to also play out dynamically, precisely because the effect of energy price shocks, which are IID, right, is going to generate an enhanced persistence in the effect of energy price changes that precisely derives from the degree of persistence of the underlying supply chain disruption or transportation shock. That's the idea, and then you can sip your coffee. This is our argument. So before turning to the specificity of the model and the results, so I hinted to the fact that at the center of this idea, there is the role of energy prices as signals, okay? So that energy prices can play, have an informational value during periods of supply chain disruption to estimate delays, okay? So we ran a simple, in order to convince us of whether this was a good assumption, we ran a Kalman filter exercise, right? Because you may say, so why when supply chain disruptions increase, when there is a high supply chain uncertainty, why don't firms simply look at some measure of transportation costs, right? Transportation prices to gauge what is going to be the effect on the possible delay on the specialized input, the microchip. So we ran a Kalman filter exercise where the idea is we have to estimate this latent process psi t, right? The true transportation delay, and there is a horse race between two signals, the energy price and the BDI index. So this is in the data. So the BDI is a common measure of transportation cost. BDI stands for the Baltic Dry Index. And so we estimate this simple Kalman filter model with maximum likelihood, and we introduce state dependency, right? So we divide the sample in two regimes, high versus low supply chain uncertainty, according to the indicator that I introduced at the beginning. And so here are the results, which are interesting. So look at these results by color, okay? So focus on the blue color first, right? So this is for the US, and each estimated point here with confidence interval shows the loading in the Kalman filter model on energy inflation as opposed to BDI, right? So here's the scope of the exercise: is do energy prices bear an informational role beyond, right, what the BDI index per second provide? And here you see when the degree of supply uncertainty is low, look at the blue case, the BDI loading is always higher, significantly higher than the loading on energy inflation, right? So by loading, I simply mean the coefficient in the estimate of the simple bivariate Kalman filter model, okay? When instead the degree of supply chain uncertainty is high, look at the red case, the relative size flips, okay? That significantly, the loading on energy inflation becomes larger in a statistically significant way relative to the BDI. So this is an encouraging empirical evidence that there is information, that valuable information that firms can gauge from energy prices in order to estimate delivery delays and the impact on their marginal cost that comes from energy prices, particularly during periods of high supply chain uncertainty. So what is the summary of the empirical evidence? First, the pass-through, I showed you that the pass-through of energy price shocks suitably identified on inflation is higher during periods of supply chain uncertainty, so it's strongly state-dependent. And secondly, I showed you that energy prices have an information value as signals that is particularly high during states of supply chain uncertainty. Okay, that's our sort of motivating empirical facts. And now let me turn to some parts of the model. So and I'm going to show you equations. So the model of the supply chain that we introduce is very stylized. So there are intermediate goods producers at the heart of production, and in the partial equilibrium simple version of this model, let me tell you that then we extend this to a general equilibrium New Keynesian model, and we sort of explore the implication for the New Keynesian Phillips curve and so on. But intermediate goods producers employ microchips and energy as inputs of production, no labor, in the simple model. And so these are the inputs, specialized input microchips and energy, and in turn, and so there is a market for this, and prices, and above, right, there are primitive shocks, two types of shocks: transportation, psi, which hits both energy and microchips, because both energy and microchips rely on transportation input for production, and, as I said, primitive IID, purely temporary raw energy shocks, right? So the bulk of the analysis is understanding what is the propagation of originally purely IID raw energy price shocks on output prices. And we say that propagation is amplified both in a static and in a dynamic way via supply chain uncertainty. So it's useful to focus the attention on the transportation market. So which is one of the markets. So think of the transportation market in terms of supply and demand of transportation. This is the only element that we highlight here, is that there is a capacity, this is a kink, there is a capacity constraint in the supply of transportation, which is actually very much in line with the data and empirical evidence, right? And so in this environment, so you can start from an unconstrained equilibrium E in the transportation market, quantity of transportation, price of transportation, right? But then there could be shocks that hit both the supply or the demand side of transportation. So on the supply side, it could be the choke point in the Strait of Hormuz, okay? But on the demand side, it could be COVID, right? Pent-up demand, excess demand for shipping of goods, and the demand of transportation shifts out so much, right, that the transportation capacity constraint becomes binding, all right? And the equilibrium in the transportation market is on the vertical portion. Same is true for the supply shock in the transportation market. The transportation supply curve shifts from, the equilibrium shifts from point E to point E prime, where the capacity constraint is binding. So what is going to be the implication, regardless of whether these are modeled as supply or demand shocks for transportation? The key implications are going to be for the prices, okay? The price, so this is the price of transportation for microchips. So M stands for microchips. This is the price of transportation for energy, okay? So for energy, precisely because energy is a very liquid, commoditized good, traded in highly liquid local markets, right? The effective and the market price of transportation they are not going to diverge, right? So the price of transportation for energy, right, is going to fully reflect the true underlying transportation shock, right? So this reflects our assumption that energy prices fully aggregate information, and they can be used as a good signal of the underlying true transportation shock. But on the other hand, the price of transportation for microchips, right, is going to deviate from the market price, right, precisely because when the transportation capacity constraint becomes binding, right, rationing is going to happen through quantities, not through prices, okay? And so the effective price of transportation for microchips is going to incorporate an unobserved delay, psi star, right, that is going to be the object of the inference analysis of firms. All right, so firms are going to form a Bayesian estimate of the transportation delay psi star, this underlying latent factor that is going to generate a wedge between the effective cost of transportation of microchips and the market price of transportation, right? Just to give you a sense of the underlying mechanism, right? Psi star is of the Bayesian recursive learning mechanism, simple one, the heart of the model. So you see psi t star being the estimate of the underlying transportation delay, right? And this estimate is going to evolve recursively, right? It's going to depend on the prior estimate of psi, conditional on the history of previous transportation shocks, but then it's going to be an error correction mechanism that goes from higher than expected energy prices that is going to have a weight that is proportional to the Kalman gain, right? And the Kalman gain is basically a function of the signal-to-noise ratio, and ultimately the signal-to-noise ratio is an increasing function of the variance of the transportation shocks that in the model is the indicator of what we call supply chain uncertainty. So the larger is the degree of supply chain uncertainty, sigma square psi, the larger is the Kalman gain, and so the more firms are going to rely on energy prices, right, as a signal to estimate this unobserved component in the transportation cost of the other input, the specialized input. So not surprisingly, this is going to have an effect on estimated real marginal cost. So the real marginal cost is going to depend on the direct effect of the energy price, okay, as with the share alpha E of energy in production. But it's also going to depend on, with the share alpha M, the microchip share in production on this estimation process of the latent process psi T star. And so here, let me conclude with two basic results. So here is the first a key result of the paper, right? So once we compute what is the pass-through of original shocks to energy prices onto output prices, right? This is going to be made of two components. One is the pass-through is going to depend sort of mechanically on the direct effect, which is going to depend on the share of energy in production. So the larger is the share of energy, the larger is the pass-through. But now there's going to be this uncertainty effect that is going to be increasing in the Kalman gain, right? So this uncertainty effect is going to be proportional to the Kalman gain. The larger is the degree of supply chain uncertainty, then so the larger is S, the signal-to-noise ratio, the larger is the Kalman gain, and so the larger is this uncertainty effect on the static pass-through, time t pass-through of energy price change on output prices. But interestingly, right, this is also going to play out dynamically, right? So you can actually compute what is the effect of original price, energy price change. Remember that here the original source of that we are interested in is shocks to energy prices, right? The dynamic pass-through of energy price change on future output prices is going to depend again on both the impact effect under uncertainty and this learning effect that is going to play out over time in a nonlinear way. Because for one, the larger is the Kalman gain, the larger is going to be this dynamic pass-through. But over time, right, you see there is a minus here, right? As time progresses and information is released, firms are going to learn over time. So the larger is the Kalman gain, then over time the dynamic pass-through is going to decrease. And so let me show you two figures to conclude. This is the impulse response in the partial equilibrium version of the model of product prices, of the product price level, in three cases to an original energy, purely IID energy price shock, raw energy price shock. And you see three cases. The green case is the case without uncertainty in supply chains, right? And the other two cases are with increasing degree of supply chain uncertainty, so when the variance of the transportation shock becomes larger. And you do see that this is large static amplification effect of the original energy price shock on the product price level, but also an effect on persistence, right? But you see that the effect on persistence is nonlinear, right? So the red case is the case with the highest degree of supply chain uncertainty. The blue case is the case with intermediate level of supply chain uncertainty. And you do see that the effect of increasing uncertainty in the supply chain on the persistence is nonlinear. And you see this playing out in this graph, right? This U-shaped effect of transportation uncertainty on the dynamic pass-through at horizon K, precisely because, yes, supply chain uncertainty amplifies the impact effect of energy price shocks, but over time, right, the higher is the uncertainty, the higher is the common gain, but over time, firms learn, right, and so this dynamic effect is going to shape out non-linearly over time. Let me just conclude saying that for those who are interested and are more sort of fixated with New Keynesian models like me, right, that we derive an uncertainty version of the New Keynesian Phillips curve, where interestingly, right, you can decompose the New Keynesian Phillips curve, this is inflation, between two components. One is the classic marginal cost-based New Keynesian Phillips curve under certainty, okay, the super baseline New Keynesian model. But here, things are going to show up additionally through uncertainty, right? You can derive sort of an endogenous cost push effect that plays out through uncertainty, right? That it's increasing precisely on the common gain, which evolves endogenously in the model. And so also the response, so this is the implications for monetary policy, right? You do see that now in general equilibrium, the response of inflation and output play out as a stagflationary shock. These are responses, again, to an original IID energy price shock, right? And so responses on inflation and output are, in a stagflationary sense, are amplified by the degree of uncertainty. So let me conclude. Right? The key insight that the volatility of supply chain shocks is an amplifier of energy price shocks. So what is the policy implication, since this is a section on monetary policy to begin with, right, is that if the economy is hit by what we believe are originally energy price shocks, that central banks should condition their response, right, on the state, the degree of uncertainty of supply chains, and caliber given that this is going to play out as a stagflationary shock, and caliber their response as a function of the underlying degree of uncertainty in supply chains. Thank you.
So the discussant is Ludwig Straub.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this wonderful paper. I have to say, when I came in this morning and I saw that Aaron was going to be the first discussant, and he just gave the nicest discussion I've ever seen. I knew the bar was very high. Gladly, the paper is very nice that they wrote, so I'm going to try to jump over that bar. Maybe not quite, but getting close. All right, so what is this paper about? It's really about probably the number one question we're all asking ourselves these days, which is, what drove the post-COVID inflation surge? Okay, see core CPI inflation. You've seen these plots numerous times. And equally numerous are the explanations that we've all come up with, right? Maybe it was fiscal policy, maybe it was sectoral reallocation, energy shocks, supply chain disruptions, capacity constraints, et cetera, et cetera. And in addition to that, we have lots of combinations of these explanations that also matter. Now, where does this paper come in? This paper says what we haven't really understood yet is that there's an interesting, important complementarity between having energy shocks during a time in which supply chains were kind of very fragile, where there was supply chain uncertainty. Okay? So it's really that intersection that this paper highlights as one potential driver of the post-COVID inflation. Okay? Let me just summarize the story of the paper just in words, and then I'm going to jump into my discussion. So here's roughly how it goes. So imagine oil and gas prices rise post-COVID for whatever reason. Then firms start getting worried that this may be because of transportation issues, right? Maybe the Suez Canal is blocked again. Maybe the Port of LA is clogged. Maybe the Houthis are attacking cargo ships again. And then they worry that this may spill over into other inputs soon. Maybe that means chips are becoming delayed, et cetera. And so they start raising prices by more than they otherwise would have had were just for the increases in oil and gas prices, okay? And that gives you additional inflation, and that is exactly that combination of firms worrying about transportation risk or supply chain uncertainty and energy shocks hitting at that moment. Okay, so I think this is a very intriguing mechanism that I had not heard before, so I really appreciate that. I learned something new, which is great. And I'm going to ask 3 questions in my discussion. The first question I'm going to ask is, how conclusive is the evidence that the paper currently, and I emphasize that, has? And I'm going to say I'm not quite convinced yet, and I'm going to tell you why. Okay? Second, how well is the model executed? I thought it was very neat. I thought it was a very nicely designed model, and I hope you all get the chance to take a look at it. And last but not least, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and see if there's any other evidence that I personally, and I will be biased as you will see, find a little more convincing on whether firms learn from their observed costs, including costs from purchasing oil or gas. And I'm going to say yes. I absolutely believe that part of the story, and I think that's very important. Okay, so let me jump into it. How conclusive is the evidence? So at the heart, the paper is about the following. On the left here, it's 2 plots. On the left here, you see core CPI and energy inflation, and you see basically they do co-move a little bit pre-COVID, but post-COVID, boy oh boy, they're really co-moving, right? And it's exactly during this time period that their measure, or one of their measures of supply chain uncertainty, comes out really high. It's a mouthful, the variance of the global supply chain pressure index. So that's why they just call it supply chain uncertainty. Turns out to be very high. And by just looking at these 2 plots, you could say, well, clearly, if I ran a regression on of core CPI inflation or overall inflation on an interaction between energy and the supply chain uncertainty index, clearly that interaction is going to come out by just eyeballing, right? Does that tell me that it's that interaction that was causally driving the inflation? I would say not yet, because if it was fiscal policy that was driving the post-COVID inflation, that interaction, I think, would still come out positive, but I wouldn't think that this is really causal evidence. But the paper obviously doesn't stop there. It does more. So let me poke a little bit around with the additional evidence that the paper shows. So for example, they show a local projection where we take oil news shocks that have been used in the past to get exogenous variation in oil prices and see what the effects are when you split the sample pre and post-COVID, or have an interaction, okay? Now, I managed to replicate the paper without their code, which is great. I have a fantastic Italian predog that did this, and it kind of looks very similar to what they have. That's because he's Italian. He's Bocconi even, Tommaso. Great training. And so this is, it's exactly the result that Tommaso showed, right? You see that post-COVID, it seems like these oil news shocks have a much bigger effect. Now, post-COVID, not really. It's really that interaction with the supply chain uncertainty measure. But then I started playing around. How much does that measure really matter versus just overall a dummy for post-COVID? Turns out the dummy kind of gets you most of this, okay? So it's not really the supply chain uncertainty that matters. It's more the dummy. And then I got curious. So if I believe it was fiscal policy driving the inflation, and I kind of take out a sort of slow-moving trend of the post-COVID inflation, thinking that could potentially be something else, not the wiggles that we typically think that are underlying these local projections, I ended up with much less of an inflationary response, which tells me personally that there's still a large role here that gets conflated with supply chain uncertainty mattering that could be filled by some other explanation of the post-COVID inflation episode. So these results, to me, don't nail it and say, oh, it's that interaction. I think it still could be lots of other stories that we've discussed. Now, it's not zero here. I don't want to say it's not there, but it's it's not as crisp, I think, as maybe the paper makes it out to be. Okay. There's also an interesting Kalman filter model that Tommaso kind of quickly went over on the Baltic Dry Index and energy inflation and the information content that shifted pre and post-COVID. I poked around with that too. I had too much spare time, I guess, this week. And so I looked at the chart of the Baltic Dry Index, and it turns out, I didn't know this, there were massive swings pre-Great Financial Crisis. And actually, it rose to 2006 to 2008 and then crashed way more than what it did, post-COVID. So I thought, what if I, change the the post-COVID period or the high uncertainty period and replace it by something other than the Great Recession period, which is what I'm doing here on the right, and I get exactly the same finding. So it's not really that it's the supply chain uncertainty that pops out here. It's just that some other sample that doesn't include the Great Recession, which is or the financial crisis, which is what the orange, the blue line includes. Okay, so I came away not thinking that was absolutely conclusive for the story. I'm not saying it's not there, but it also made sense to me because it's ultimately very hard to test their mechanism with public data, right? After all, the story is about firms not knowing if there are transportation disruptions, right? And a lot of the disruptions that these indices capture are very highly publicized, right? The New York Times even had like a latest Suez Canal updates, button there, link there when it reported on the Suez Canal blockage. The Houthis, everything is just all over the place in the news. So I wasn't quite sure, maybe public data isn't so natural to test this. Did these have effects on energy prices? They did, but it was kind of small and it kind of mean reverted relatively quickly. So you could maybe interpret that as some kind of evidence in favor of the mechanism, but it's very, very short-lived. Okay, so let me jump into the model. So I thought the model was very nicely done. I'm just going to summarize it extremely quickly. We have firms. What are they using to produce? They're using chips and they're using oil. Both of these have to be shipped to the firm, so there's transportation that's needed. Okay? There are two shocks. There's an IID oil supply shock, and there is an Air One transportation shock. The key ingredient into the model is that firms only see the oil price they're actually paying. They don't know if, when the oil price goes up, if that's an oil supply shock or the transportation shock. And so when the oil price goes up, they kind of worry, well, maybe it's a transportation crisis, and my chips are going to be delayed soon, and that's why my costs are going to rise, and that's why I want to increase my prices more. Okay? That's how the story works. My first reaction was, okay, so what does this do? Just before my reaction, it leads to initial overreaction because when they see higher oil prices, they worry about the chips becoming delayed. And the second is there's kind of a relatively quick mean reversal because once the oil prices go back down, because they're IID, if it was an oil supply shock, you kind of get mean reversion, right? You learn that it was not a transportation shock. So my first reaction was, can't they just talk to their chip suppliers? Hey guys, are your chips going to be delayed because of your, ship being stuck in the Port of LA? But then once I thought more about it, it's just, it's a simplified description of the world. Clearly there's a long supply chain, right? I might not even know who in Taiwan is producing exactly my chips and shipping it because there's a supplier, of a supplier of a supplier, okay? So it's much more complicated than that, and I get that we don't want all the complication in the world in that model, okay? And the second is, thought I had as more of a suggestion. I thought these oil supply shocks, typically when they're not coming from transportation effects, are much more permanent than maybe these transportation, effects. So I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that. IID versus Air One. Maybe we should flip which is Air One and which is IID. Okay. Finally, let me talk about other evidence on firms learning from costs. So at the core of this mechanism is that firms learn about their future costs from their current costs. For example, what do higher oil prices mean going forward? And this leads them to expect costs will remain high, even though maybe eventually they won't remain high. Now I ask myself, so is there other evidence that kind of confirms this kind of behavior? And lo and behold, my own student, Hugo Monnery, just wrote a job market paper on that exact issue, okay? Not advertising him, by the way, to hire him. He already has a job. He's going to Oxford. But if you would like to invite him for a seminar, he's fantastic. Okay? What is this job market paper doing? It uses data from the Atlanta Fed's Business Inflation Expectation Survey, which I learned is highly underutilized. It's a great survey. And basically what they document is that firms are kind of like adaptive, okay? They forecast future costs almost entirely based on past costs. Kind of in line with the story of the paper here, okay? Let me just show you two plot and what that looks like. Turns out the paper also talks about oil shocks. I'm going to use that example from the paper. And they basically distinguish firms that are sort of, fast exposed to oil price shocks, kind of more upstream firms closer to oil, and the more downstream firms that are, have to wait, for a year to be actually exposed by oil. And what they show is that for the latter group, the firms that are sort of more slowly exposed to oil price shocks, you see that when you run local projections of the kind that Tommaso and Alfonso run, you see that its cost growth going forward in red here is very predictable. If they read the news and knew where they were in the supply chain, they could figure out, oh yeah, if the oil price goes up today, chances are my input costs are going to rise in 12 months. Okay? But they're not doing that. When the Atlanta Fed asks them, can you forecast your costs, please, over the next 12 months? They're saying, oh no, my costs are probably not going to increase very much. Okay? Because it's hard to do it. It's hard to know exactly where you are, to do the math of, how long until you're affected by the oil price shocks, et cetera. So you see their forecasts in blue kind of remarkably tracking their experienced costs. Okay, so they don't do the full gymnastic that people in our models do. They don't have the full information, and so it's kind of like in the paper by Tommaso and Alfonso that they don't fully understand the world, even though maybe some of the cost increases are kind of driven by things like oil price movements that are readily available that they could actually look at. Okay, second plot. These are the firms that are directly affected by oil price shocks. You see the price. Their input costs jump up in red, and they, like you would expect, right? They do increase their cost forecasts right away because their costs go up right away. So it's really their costs that are driving their forecasts, and are trying to learn from their costs about future costs. Perfect, and that gives them, perfect. Let me jump to the conclusion. So I thought this was a very interesting paper on an extremely important topic, how much firms know about and learn from their current costs. And they apply this to the post-COVID inflation episode. I thought that was super interesting to learn about that perspective. My take was I'm not fully convinced yet, happy to stand corrected by the evidence in the paper, but I'm absolutely convinced that firms do learn from their own experience costs, and I think that's an area of this literature that we should really push more into, and I think the paper that they wrote is a fantastic starting point. And I thought the model was very neat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Tommaso, maybe you want to reply shortly, and then we can collect questions. Yes. Yeah.
Should I turn it on? No. Okay. Okay. So I had high expectations on Ludwig's discussion, and so for this I have to thank Egon, or I don't know who in the background picked Ludwig, because this was a very useful and thoughtful discussion. So let me reply on three aspects, mostly two. So one thing that you point out is the evidence conclusive at, if you want, at the aggregate level of this degree of sort of how much, if you want, the channel that we emphasize that has to do with the heightened supply chain uncertainty sort of can explain, for example, the inflationary period, right? So that is absolutely a reasonable question. There was something else going on. To be honest, and so we'll look into that with controls, for example, and or even more, starting with the local projections. So the purpose of the purpose, I think, of the exercise on the empirical side was, to be honest, was not really, or less explain 21-23 inflation. Of course, it's a big, important episode. It's going to drive a lot of our results. But I think we want to try to be more general in thinking that maybe we are heading into a world, or we already are in a world with this underlying supply chain disruptions as a latent state could actually be very materially a very important element of the environment, right? And these episodes could very much become way more frequent, right? Whether they could come from pandemics, whether they could come from geopolitical risk, whether they could come from other supply chain type of disruptions, they might become an important element, structural element of the environment. And so in a way, if you want, so the paper is really does not try, but I understand why one gets that impression, to be a paper on 21-22, explaining 21-23 inflation, although, of course, we believe this is a possible mechanism. We cannot conclude that it was only this sort of supply side enhanced mechanism through supply chain uncertainty, but of course other things were going on. Ludwig pointed to fiscal policy, of course, but we're trying not to be in that camp of explaining 21-23 inflation. We really want to point out a mechanism that could be at the heart of future events and like a structural mechanism that should be taken into account in assessing the transmission of shocks and in evaluating policy normatively. So in that vein, the evidence is not conclusive, but I guess it's not conclusive in being the main factor that explains 21-23 inflation. I agree, okay, but we hope there will be other episodes in the future. So, the second is, so I'm happy that you sort of captured the spirit of the model, right? That, and actually, maybe Alfonso knew about the paper of the student. So I didn't know, and that's a very interesting suggestion. Yes, firms are adaptive in the way they evaluate costs in this environment in a very simple way, right? They have a prior, they have an updating mechanism, but of course there are past priors that is based on the observation of previous transportation shocks. Is actually matters, and it's updated through a learning mechanism. So in that sense, so I don't know if in this paper there is a model. I'll be curious to look at it, but it's a fantastic reference for us, and actually also a push towards generally, I think, as you're saying, working on models in which we dig deeper on how firms think about their costs and how they extrapolate from signals into perceived marginal costs. Yeah. So.
Okay, so let's collect some questions. In interest of time, let's keep the questions short if possible. So yes, I have 2 questions over there.
Love the topic, love the paper, very interesting and has a lot of intuitive appeal. I guess I have a few questions. 2 kinds of behavior you didn't mention, both begin with H. One is hoarding and the other is hedging. Mm-hmm. Hoarding behavior sometimes characterizes uncertainty about supply, for sure. And we've seen many examples of that, not just in energy, but in others. In energy, of course, you might have diverse sources of supply, so that might get around some of the issues. We see that going on today. But I think the things that trigger hoarding behavior, like uncertainty over supply, might be useful to sort of contemplate. The second may be more substantive, and that's hedging behavior. We can use financial markets for commodities in particular to hedge the risk of supply shocks. And so airlines do this, other transportation modes also do this. And I think there's a lot of information in futures options and in the whole term structure of these things. And in thinking about not just where they are in terms of level, but in thinking about the persistence of volatility in those measures, which I think is pretty important in thinking about how people react to the insurance premiums they have to pay for those things. So I think there's more information there that might be useful in thinking about it. Second, in terms of commodities, we know that typically commodities are inelastically demanded and inelastically supplied. A lot of them. Energy is a good example, but there are others. What we see going on with beef today, I think, is a good example. because people are complaining about beef prices. And yet the supply response in the short run is pretty inelastic because it takes time to grow the beef. And, so people can't respond in time. Now, if there are alternative sources of supply, like Argentina or some other place, that might be helpful. But I think thinking about the elasticities of demand and supply in this context might be important. And the last point is this kind of behavior, I think, applies not just to energy, obviously, but it applies to a whole bunch of commodities, rare earths, other things. So I'm wondering if, taking this one step further, we talked a little bit in the previous session about geopolitical risk and connecting it to this. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a good example. Yeah. And it's also a good example of a circumstance in which you had multiple areas of commodities that were affected by a supply shock. So you had food, you had energy, those were the two of the big ones. And, I think those things are worth thinking about.
Okay, so Martin? Hello. No.
I can speak louder. Okay. Question is about the implications for monetary policy. On the one hand, if I take the model literally.
Martin, keep the mic with you. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah,
there you are. It's a learning process by the microphone. So if I take the model and the results very seriously, I should think that central banks should do nothing about it, about this mechanism, because first, this is a relative price shock, and second, there is some learning process. But on the other hand, life is tougher, and people are learning at the same time with a lot of noise and noisy signals at the same time. So it's not clear in reality that central banks should do nothing, because the learning process may take more time. So my question is whether you think central bank should do anything about it, and in particular, whether a central bank communication should be devoted to make this learning process faster. Thank you very much.
Egon?
I really like the paper, and I think, Ludwig, your discussion really helped. Great to put in context. I was just, it seems like there was a natural role for inventories in your model. That's the whole point. You could stock up in this, you draw them out. So I think it's related to Dick's point about hoarding, beyond hedging. We know this plays interesting things. It could be also something you observe in the data, at the firm level data, so it might be able to get you a bit of an identification that could help with some of Ludwig's comments, of tightening the story. Great. But very nice work, really lovely stuff.
And then I have also Alan over there.
So the big contribution of the paper, which is very significant, is the attention to the supply chain as it affects inflation, as it can affect thinking of monetary policy. Mm-hmm. Kudos for that. On the other stories that the discussant raised, there are other stories. One story that wasn't mentioned, surprised, I'm a macro guy, was the reaction of, well, you had it in the list, or you had it in the list of possibilities, fiscal and monetary policy. Now, in work that I did at the time, we looked at the fiscal policy stimulus of a number of bills that came out of the Biden and Trump administration, and the total net fiscal stimulus as percent of GDP was bigger than that measure of fiscal stimulus of World War II. That's pretty big. And with lags, fiscal policy, all of us would say, can affect price inflation. Monetary policy came riding to the rescue. So the analogy I use is you're walking across the street, a healthy guy, the truck hits you, you're flattened, you're dead. That was COVID. And so what do the paramedics do? They rush to the rescue. The fiscal policy was rescue. The monetary policy was rescue. And you don't know about the patient, dead or not, So you overstimulate the patient. That's logical. That's what both policies did. The patient bounced back and surprised everybody how well the patient really was, and inflation shot up. Now, along with inflation came higher oil prices with some independent sources, but a lot of stuff was going on. So there is yet another story, which is stages of processing, pricing. Oil prices go up, gas prices go up, transportation costs go up. What supermarkets pay go up, prices go up. There's a whole big chain. We don't do that in macroeconomics. We use very simple models of inflation. But that's part of the other story, and it takes time when that happens, and it persists and goes on because it gets into wages and all kinds of things, and that is missing from this analysis. So I'm pleased with the contribution. I think you shortened the paper to make that the focus, and I'm pleased with the discussant and quite intrigued with the paper that he's referring to that gets further into this. It's great to have it, though.
Last question by Sebnem, and then Tommaso will reply.
No, that's good.
Yeah,
It's working? Okay. Yeah. All right, great paper. But I just want to add to these things, since we have been working on this with Alvaro Silva here since 2022. This high demand in a supply constrained environment gives you inflation is that conclusion I think we all get. But then it is important that if you are in the matching exercise, as Ludwig is saying, how much of the U.S. fund is from fiscal policy and demand? Because A, it is impossible to match inflation in the U.S. without the fiscal. In Europe, you can do it, but in the U.S., it's impossible. B, without knowing that, you cannot go back to the policy thing. Because the big thing in this whole supply constraint, high demand-driven inflation is what is the monetary policy supposed to do? I mean, that goes back to the original transitory permanent debate. And when we were presenting our paper at the Sintra in 2022 with all the central bank governors there, that's the question. Then what can we do? And then that goes back to this demand-supply imbalance, right? If supply is constrained and you have these pump-up demand through fiscal policy and all that, then monetary policy can only cut that demand and bring them in balance. And this was in speech after speech in Powell's conferences, also Lagarde. So I think in that sense, one very important thing from your paper, because you just said you want to do a general thing and not, this whole matching the inflation in U.S. and Europe, then if there is no aggregate demand shock, no fiscal, no nothing, and no supply cost plus shock either, just the uncertainty bit, just the uncertainty, not just the cost plus shock itself, just the uncertainty bit, combined with these adaptive expectations or whatever, how do firms think about it, how much that can give. I think that's going to be an important thing.
Thanks.
Yeah, to nail down.
Okay, Tommaso, you have 6 minutes to address all these questions.
That's okay. So thank you. These were great questions and comments. I think we're going to learn, and we're learning a lot from this. So hoarding and hedging, I think this great. I mean, it's these are crucial suggestions. Thinking more deeply about again the same problem that also Ludwig brought about. How do firms actually cope with the cost uncertainty? Okay, so before knowing about the Ludwig's student paper that provides evidence on sort of this adaptive behavior of firms, I would have answered this question and said, look, in the evidence that we are exploring now, that is based on earnings calls by firms and searching with text analysis for the relevance of keywords like energy and uncertainty and supply chain and so on, we really don't find evidence of hedging behavior of this type of transportation delay or transportation costs, latent transportation costs. So that's sort of a minimal answer, but definitely going back also to Egan's point. But then knowing about the paper that Ludwig mentioned, right? I'm happy to know. I'll have to look into that with interest. That despite the availability of all these instruments, firms which should like futures and so apparently firms adopt this very adaptive type of behavior. That's very intriguing, and we came sort of we came from different directions, in orthogonal directions, and it's a kind of intriguing question of why. It might be, for example, particularly true for this type of uncertainty related to supply chain and transportation, and so hedging against those events might be more complicated. I don't know, but that's really food for thought. Then you mentioned elastic supply or demand. So you say, you said, for example, for other commodities like food, elasticity of labor supply, the supply elasticity is small. Where we think of energy as different from food, okay? And especially in the context of the model, right? What's really important is that the supply of energy is more elastic than the supply of microchips. That's all it matters. And I think this is very realistic because materially, right, if there's a choke point and energy, oil and microchips are stuck on the same ship, energy still comes, okay? You can, at a higher price, but there is no quantity rationing on energy. That's the key, right? And of course, in a more elaborate model, you want to think about an accurate calibration of elasticities. Yes, Egon, of course, I knew you would have this point. You should think of the role of inventories. Sort of, in a sense, the pricing behavior that goes on here is a sort of an inventory pricing behavior. Okay, so there is precautionary pricing going on because of this effect. So, but of course we don't model inventories. We should look very much into the data. And as you say, at the firm level data, one can actually see, right? So firms that are possibly in a Bartic instrument sense, more hit by that transportation supply chain uncertainty, whether they rely on inventories more, whether they adjust prices more or less, absolutely. Yeah, so monetary policy. So I really don't understand the look-through argument. I never really understood it, and I don't think there is basic theory that supports the look-through argument based on the idea. So let's say, right, you hear it all the time. So it's a supply shock, or let's say an energy price shock. It's a relative price change. Monetary policy should look through. I don't. Since the work of Boll and Mankiw, we understood that in a world of flexible prices, that would be exactly right. But in a world of nominal rigidities, that's not true. And so even in the most basic New Keynesian model, forget about uncertainty effects like we have here, you have to respond to cost push shocks, right? So even if it's a pure supply shock that you could think it may come from a change in relative prices, but with nominal rigidities, that morphs into an aggregate supply shock. So I thought we knew that from Boll and Mankiw, and I still don't understand. That I heard a month ago this lecture that John Cochrane gave on inflation in Zurich at the Polytechnic, and it's all about that. So you guys seem very worried about or interested about how do we explain the inflationary episode of 21-23? Can this mechanism explain it or not? I agree with Ludwig. Probably we cannot explain the whole inflation episode, but that's not our interest, as Nem was emphasizing. But thinking that the whole inflationary episode of 21-23 in the U.S. was driven by fiscal policy, that's like he believes, because supply shocks cannot explain inflationary episodes because they are intrinsically relative price shocks, I really don't understand it. I really don't buy it. So I don't, given this premise, I don't understand the look-through argument in its essence beyond the characteristics of this model. Well, we can talk about it. And again, let me also turning to Sebnem, definitely she suggests a very interesting exercise that we could do. So just feed a more elaborate model where also you have a demand fiscal expansion, like we observed it mostly in the U.S. and not in the Eurozone. By the way, this paper is about the Eurozone and the U.S., right? It's not only, so it's about a mechanism that potentially played out for both, right? And of course, our model is very simple, sort of it tries to elucidate a simple mechanism, but it can be brought to a more general quantitative model. Maybe Alfonso I forgot something. You definitely have more to say, but otherwise, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso and Ludwig. So this closes our second session. We will have lunch in the room where on this